All right, everyone, let's really think about what was going on in the North American colonies back then. The truth is, whether Britain taxed tea or made it cheaper, the colonists couldn't have cared less. And why is that? Because most of them were already drinking cheap smuggled Dutch tea anyway. But it's in this totally unrelated situation that the Boston Tea Party happens. And this is the part that's so incredibly weird. Think about it. They weren't going to buy British tea anyway, and the British government actually made it cheaper, so from a consumer's perspective, there was literally no downside, right? So why in the world did the Boston Tea Party happen? It's because you had people with a hardcore activist streak, the kind of people who believe protesting makes the world better. All we have to do is hit the streets. More and more people started buying into this idea. And it kind of makes sense. Remember how I told you they protested furiously against the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, and a huge protest broke out in Boston? Well, starting with that success, the number of people who got a taste for protesting skyrocketed. And the problem with that is, people started showing up with ambitions, thinking, hey, I can use this to become a politician. Yep, that's right. Ambitious political wannabes set the stage and riled up the public just like this. My fellow colonists, I'm sure you're all enjoying your smuggled Dutch tea, right? But that's not the point. Why do those pathetic Brits dare to tell us what to do without any consideration for our sovereignty, for our rights as people of the North American colonies? Sure, the tea is cheaper and we haven't lost any money, but are we just going to sit here and let Britain interfere in our lives? Who knows what they'll do next? That's the vibe. Britain had gotten rid of almost all the taxes, leaving just a tiny one on tea, which didn't even matter to us because we were drinking smuggled stuff anyway. But it was the principle of it. The fact that Britain is telling us what to do is what pisses me off. You feel me? Yeah, you feel me. So, the agitation starts like this, and then people who were paid off by these ambitious wannabe politicians, people hired by these political instigators, deliberately go to the Boston Harbor and start chucking tea chests into the sea. And that is the Boston Tea Party. It was all engineered from start to finish. The plan went something like this. First, dump all the tea sold by the British government to seriously piss off the British. Second, if a bloody conflict breaks out and a few of our guys die, look everyone, the British are killing us, the people of the North American colonies. That gives them the perfect angle for some major propaganda. Third, once you have the perfect justification for a coup and the coup succeeds, I'm a shoo-in for a politician. Ka-ching. This grand scheme was what? The Boston Tea Party. That's what it was. So they dressed up as Native Americans down at the Boston Harbor and caused a scene. And right on cue, just as planned, what do you know? The British government takes the bait. Look at these punks. How dare they throw our tea into the sea? Shut down the Boston Harbor immediately. Arrest every last one of those protesters. And just like that, they got the reaction they wanted. There were two masterminds behind the Boston Tea Party. The ones funding it from the shadows and engineering the whole thing. Their names were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. So, the two guys who orchestrated the Boston Tea Party, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Now, this Samuel Adams guy, for a full 10 years before the Tea Party, was the one running around shouting, "We need to stage a coup. Let's declare independence. We need to separate." He was a guy who was desperate to be a politician, just biding his time, waiting for a major protest to break out. In fact, his family had been a political family since the early to mid-1700s. The colonies had their own local politicians back then, you see. So, after singing his independence tune for 10 years, in 1773, he finally made the Boston Tea Party go boom. And then there's John Hancock. You know what this guy's job was? He was a tea smuggler. So, he hears the news that official British tea is about to come in at a ridiculously cheap price. He must have thought, oh, I'm screwed. I mean, his whole business was smuggling Dutch tea to sell it cheap. And now the official stuff is coming in even cheaper. His business was totally wrecked. He knew that he had to find another way, fast. So, there you have it. You've got Samuel Adams, the political operator who'd wanted to be a politician forever, and John Hancock, the smuggler who was panicking that cheap British tea would ruin his business. The Boston Tea Party was orchestrated primarily by these two men. And by the way, this tea smuggler, John Hancock, was the very first person to sign the American Declaration of Independence. Knowing that, you start to get a clearer picture of what kind of people were among America's founding fathers, don't you? Anyway, just as they planned, the British government cracks down on the colonists. They close the Boston harbor, halt all imports and exports, dissolve the assembly, and start sending in more troops. What was the scenario they wanted? To get a rise out of the British, have a few colonists die in the ensuing violence, and then have the perfect image for their propaganda campaign, right? And now, the British government was setting the stage for them perfectly. On top of that, there was a book that was all the rage in the colonies at the time, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. This book is what really started to solidify the idea among the British colonists that, yeah, we really need to split. Paine's Common Sense basically said this: does it make any common sense for this tiny little island nation, Britain, to rule over the vast continent of North America? It is common sense that we should be independent. It was all about this idea of common sense. With a book like this making the rounds, and with the Boston Tea Party as a catalyst, more and more people, including those guys who were waiting for their moment, got swept up in the agitation. A wave of independence sentiment washed over the colonies, and people were massively riled up, shouting, "Independence! Independence!" It was chaos. Sensing that the time has finally come, the most influential people in America gathered to seriously discuss independence. You've probably heard of them, the big shots from the colonies at the time, right? People like John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. They all get together. Of course, not all of them were there just for their own self-interest. There were definitely people who genuinely hoped to create a good country, but a whole lot of them were in it for themselves. And what do we call this meeting where these guys started talking about independence? The First and Second Continental Congresses. But word of this gets back to the British government. Hey, what are those colonists up to? Are they gathering to plot treason? As soon as news of the Continental Congress reached Britain, they cracked down even harder. British soldiers started doing random searches and imposing curfews, which the colonists thought, look at these guys, we're already dying for independence, and now they're searching us and locking us down? It was like pouring gasoline on a fire, right? They really pissed them off. And then, it finally happens. Bloodshed. In Lexington, Massachusetts, a colonist is shot and killed by British troops. The second that one person died, the guys who were waiting for their chance went wild with propaganda. Look, everyone, the British treat us, the people of North America, as less than human. They treat us like human garbage. Look, how much longer must we suffer at the hands of these tyrants? The wannabe politicians had just found their cheat code, and now the American Revolutionary War officially begins. To put it simply, it was a war started by British people living in the British colonies, staging a coup against their own motherland to build a new country. As the war kicks off, what do? They issue the American Declaration of Independence. Those same guys I mentioned, they all gathered again. You know that famous painting of them signing the Declaration of Independence.
At first glance, it looks like they're all gathered for some noble purpose, signing one by one, right? Well, it had that meaning, but it also had another. It was also a kind of written pact to prevent each other from backing out or betraying the cause if the war against Britain went south. A pact. Because back then, each of the North American colonies had different representatives and completely different interests. Even though they were all saying, let's be independent, let's stage a coup, it wouldn't have been surprising if someone had betrayed the others once the war actually started. Seriously, even when America first became independent, it didn't control all this land. At first, it was just this much, only a fraction. Britain could have easily reconquered it, and it wouldn't have been weird for someone to switch sides based on their own interests. That's why they had to write such a thorough pact. And so, from 1775 to 1783, the American Revolutionary War raged on, a war between Great Britain and those trying to found the United States. Obviously, in the beginning, the British Empire was a powerhouse, but the colonists were fighting for their lives, so it was a back-and-forth struggle, and they managed to hold on. They were holding on, but suddenly, these guys pop up out of nowhere. France! France just jumps into the American Revolutionary War and starts providing massive support to the American independence movement. I mean, whether the US became a country or not, whether it fought with Britain or not, why would France care? It was someone else's problem. So why on earth did they get involved? I mentioned this before. The British and French colonies in North America fought like crazy over beaver fur, and back in Europe, they fought like crazy in the 7 Years' War. In other words, in European history, Britain and France are what? Eternal rivals. That's what I'm saying. They've almost never been on good terms. So their rival nation, Britain, is about to have its colonies split in half and break away. From France's point of view, what is that? It's a celebration, a party. It's a big thank you. But in the beginning, France didn't send troops directly. They were also struggling economically after the 7 Years' War, so a head-on confrontation with Britain was a bit much. So instead of fighting directly, they gave their full support by providing supplies to the American forces. But even with France helping from behind the scenes, how could the North American colonists possibly beat the British Empire? It was still an uphill battle. So what did the American leaders do? They sent diplomats. And who did they send them to? Only to the countries that had beef with Britain. You guys can't stand Britain either, right? We're about to break off a piece of their territory, so give us a hand. And what do you know? Several countries actually started sending soldiers to help the American founders. Chief among them were France, which had terrible relations with Britain over territory, the Netherlands, which was constantly clashing with them over colonies in Southeast Asia, and Spain, which fought them anytime they met in the Atlantic. These countries began to fully support the American cause with military aid. Oh, and did you know this? The Native Americans living in the colonies at the time, most of the tribes helped the British. Huh? Wait, Olivia, didn't you say the British were killing the natives with guns and swords? So why would the natives help the British? It doesn't really make sense, does it? From the natives' point of view, it was like this. Yeah, the British are bad guys, but if those so-called founding fathers who are staging this coup create their own country, it's going to be even worse for us. A ton of native tribes thought this way. They figured it was better for Britain to stay in control. That's why quite a few tribes sided with the British. And in the end, the American founders won the war. They actually defeated the British Empire. How could that have happened? I mean, sure, Spain, France, and the Netherlands helped, but their opponent was still the British Empire, right? But we've been overlooking something. And what is that? The power of Mother Nature.
We were overlooking the power of Mother Nature. Now look, the colonies over here want to break away and become independent, right? So for the British Army to fight them, what do they have to do? They have to come over by boat. And do you know how long it takes to get from here to here? 60 days. A full 2 months. 2 months! You might think, so what? Can't they just think of it as a 2-month cruise? Maybe today you could. Nowadays, ships have refrigerators, freezers, and all kinds of pantries, so you could cram 2 months' worth of food in there. But they didn't have any of that back then. So it was common for everyone to get scurvy. For example, in the famous game League of Legends, the sailor character eats an orange to cure himself. That's all based on this historical fact. For 2 months, they were coming over eating almost nothing but salted meat and fish. After suffering for 2 months to cross the Atlantic, by the time the soldiers disembarked, they were already ravaged by scurvy, looking like hell with sallow, yellow faces. The British Army had to fight in a near-death state. That's the condition they were in for the war. You see what I'm saying? This is one of the reasons why the geopolitical position of the North American continent, with the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other, is considered so incredible. There are no rivals to challenge them from the north or south, and to get to them from the sides takes forever. This has massive geopolitical significance. It's precisely why America's geopolitical location is so highly valued in modern international politics. And so, on September 3rd, 1783, after winning the final battle, Great Britain had no choice but to recognize their independence. Finally, the United States of America was born. But the country was founded, and for 6 years, there was no president. The office was vacant. Why didn't they elect one for 6 whole years? Remember who a lot of the founders were? People looking out for their own interests. People who wanted to grow their businesses and become politicians. The ka-ching crowd. With guys like that gathered together, creating an absolute figure like a president seemed like a bad idea. That person's power couldn't be too strong. And if possible, they wanted a president they could control. For them to run their businesses, become politicians, or do whatever it took to line their pockets, they needed to be able to pull the president's strings. They couldn't have a president telling them what to do. Because of this issue, they debated the election of a president for 6 years, with almost no progress. Of course, even before the war ended, founding fathers like George Washington had discussed this. If we create a nation called the United States, let's call our head of state a president, not a king.
But there's a reason they initially used the word president. The idea was, this president is a nobody. He's just a guy who moderates meetings and acts as an MC, someone to shake hands and greet foreign dignitaries when they visit. The moderator, the president, is nothing. That was the level they had set for the role. Why would they want to make the president such a figurehead at first? Why was America founded in the first place? It was a country created by people who wanted to protect their own interests, who were annoyed by Britain telling them what to do, and who hated being controlled by the British government. So they needed a leader like a king, but their mindset was, there is no way we're going to let some guy like you tell us what to do in this country we built to line our own pockets. Absolutely not. And that's why they went 6 years without a president in that pathetic state. It was a total mess. That's why even today, the U.S. Congress has so much power, the Senate and the House. The power of Congress was strengthened to prevent the president from running the country however he pleased. This didn't start with some noble idea of democracy or serving the will of the people. It was for their own self-interest. Representatives from their states would enter Congress, right? And for those representatives to protect their interests back home, the president's power had to be weak, and Congress's power had to be strong. So that's the reason for the strong authority of the U.S. Congress. Don't even start with that naive talk about considering the will of the people, thinking of the nation. Not in the late 1700s America. The separation of powers came from this too. It was to stop the president from doing whatever he wanted. We learn that the separation of powers is the foundation of democracy and obviously a good thing, but when it first appeared in America, it was purely for the purpose of kneecapping of the president. If this form of government had continued without any changes from the late 1700s until now, the United States might have fractured into 50 different countries. It could have completely broken apart state by state. Of course, the U.S. wasn't perfect right after its founding. While they were stuck without a president for 6 years due to these internal conflicts, a rebellion suddenly breaks out in Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion. This was a huge deal. With no real president, the bureaucracy wasn't functioning properly, the country was ungovernable, and there was a reason this rebellion happened. What did the Founding Fathers say when they were first trying to rally people to create America? The British government is pushing us around. They're trying to tax us however they want, and who knows what they'll do next. We must become independent and reclaim our sovereignty. That's what they said. But after they became independent, they started levying massive taxes themselves. Why? Because it was right after the war. After a war, a country has no money. The treasury was wrecked. The U.S. had also drained its coffers fighting the Revolutionary War. Why did Britain create the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts before the Boston Tea Party? Because their treasury was empty after the 7 Years' War. It's the exact same thing. After the Revolutionary War, the United States was also broke. What has this country ever done for us? They spouted all that propaganda about creating a better country if we just broke away from Britain, and now they're hitting us with huge taxes too. This kind of resentment exploded into a massive rebellion. The rebellion was quickly suppressed, but what it signified was crystal clear. Wow, the people must be really unhappy with us. There's a ton of resentment simmering against the Founding Fathers. In other words, it meant a second or third rebellion could break out at any time. It was after this rebellion that the conversation about finally picking a president after 6 years without one rapidly gained momentum. They felt a sense of crisis, thinking, okay, we created this country to line our own pockets, but seeing the people rebel like this, we could be in real trouble. If rebellions started popping up everywhere, they could actually be swallowed up by Britain again. And if that happened, everything the Founding Fathers had schemed for, getting rich off the people's blood and sweat, would all go up in smoke. At the time, the U.S. territory was only about this big in the very beginning. This part was a British colony, this was a Spanish colony. That's how it was. So if a massive rebellion broke out here, Britain could just roll down saying, "Oh, you rebels, allow us to help you." They started to think, this could be a real disaster. Forget about the president meddling in our business interests for a second. We need to at least have strong leadership. The mood shifted. Initially, they used the title president because they wanted a figurehead. But after seeing this massive rebellion, they realized they needed a strong leader. So they decided they had to give the president more power, but at the same time, they thought, but we can't give him so much power that he can interfere with our business interests. So what did they create? The separation of powers. The separation of powers was born from this idea, we have to prevent the president from ever interfering in our affairs. I won't go into detail about the separation of powers since you all know about it. So, with this system in place, the power of the American presidency was finally strengthened and talk of the first president began in earnest. If we give voting rights to every ignorant farmer and commoner in the name of democracy, it'll be a disaster. The people can have the first round of voting, but the second round, the final decision, must be made by us elites, the wealthy. And with that, the system that still exists to this day was created, that is the Electoral College.